Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm going to be talking about humanoids today. Today's episode is called Unearthly 12 Very Weird Extraterrestrial Encounters. I've got a lot of cases today, 12 cases coming from all over the world, including Denmark, France, Italy, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Australia, Argentina and Brazil, and a couple from the United States, including Missouri and Michigan. So quite a wide variety of locations. Cases going all the way back to 1945 up to 2018. So some recent cases as well. What I like about this episode is there's a huge variety of humanoids. I mean, we have short little ones, less than a foot tall, all the way up to ones that are over 10 feet tall. All different kinds of humanoids. It's one of the most fascinating aspects of humanoid encounters. And I think these cases, I've said it before, have a lot to teach us. I think the simplest takeaway is that we are not alone in this universe and that Earth is definitely an object of great interest to a wide variety of extraterrestrials. A lot of evidence supporting these cases, landing traces, medical evidence, animal reactions, all of these kinds of things, electromagnetic disturbances, and of course, a lot of multiple witness cases, which always raises the level of credibility of a case. So, lots of cases to go over today. Let's just get started. First case I want to talk about is definitely one of my favorite in this little collection. I call this one a 6-inch humanoid. This one occurred way back in April 20, 1945 in Renève, France, and it's a very unusual case, which I think really deserves a wide audience. This case has been widely published and exhaustively investigated and documented with a 100-plus page report on this case, which explored every possible explanation. It is a single witness case involving an anonymous ordained priest. He was 34 years old at the time of the incident. You can actually see him here. He's well respected in his community, where he had served as a parish priest for 11 years. It was on April 20, 1945, that the father was sent by his governess to go pick edible champignon mushrooms in the forest outside of Renève, France. She told him that the mushrooms grew best right along the edge of the forest, so that's where he went, following along a dirt road that led into the woods. He did have some trouble finding the mushrooms, but did manage to pick some and started to head back. And as the father says, I noticed a last bush, and it was when I wanted to get up that I saw on my left, in full sunlight, this tiny little creature. Needless to say, the father was absolutely astonished at what he was looking at. It was a beautiful sunlit day, and he had a perfect view of this tiny little 6-inch humanoid. The creature was advancing towards him and was no more than 3 feet away. And he could immediately see that this was a human-looking figure, pretty much normal except for his extremely diminutive size. As the father says, a rather chubby gentleman. He was pot-bellied, corpulent, very strong, robust. He was someone who had robust health, a man in miniature. He had a little bit of a beard, not abundant, in gray-white. He walked very quickly. He came up to me and stared at me. He was, as if, out of breath, staring at me, and I was staring at him. You could see he was out of breath, that he was an old man. I'd give him an age of 70, 75. What caught my attention above all was his face and his eyes. He wore a rust-brown combination, a kind of jumpsuit. No buttons, no belts, no seams. The hands ended in a kind of mittens, the thumb and the fingers all enclosed. The feet, they were a kind of boots. They were all one, but they were flexible. Everything all made of a single garment. One peculiar detail about this little creature's outfit, which was skin-tight, but as the father says, flexible, was the presence of what looked like a pike or a rod, kind of like a thorn, he said, cream-colored, and was strapped to his side or back. This little rod stuck up over the figure's head about a half inch and went all the way down to his feet. The father did have the impression that it was used as a weapon, perhaps, or perhaps to probe the ground or defend himself against wildlife, or he speculated later, perhaps an antenna of some kind. Now, the father's first impulse was to gently pick up this little humanoid, ask him who he was, where he came from, what he was doing there, if he needed anything, because he did appear to be in some kind of distress. But the father didn't do that because this being was moving along. As the father says, I had an impression of fear and that he was in a hurry. You could feel that he was in a hurry. He seemed to me exhausted and frightened. He seemed to dread my presence. He seemed fearful of me. His piercing eyes seemed filled with fear, and at the same time to want to observe me. He wanted to know who I was and what I was doing. So this father wondered if this little man was rushing to deliver information or was on some kind of mission for survival, because he just kept walking, turning his head to keep the father in view. He actually passed just about 1 to 2 feet away from the father and then disappeared into a thicket that, as the father says, was, quote, impenetrable even for a rat or a cat. And as the father says, he passed 30 centimeters away from me while looking at me intensely. So the duration of this encounter was quite short, an estimated 15 seconds. Afterwards, the father noticed no footprints. He never heard any strange sounds or smelled anything unusual. He did feel a sense of disappointment that he had let this figure escape, but his astonishment was so great that he simply returned home. He planned to return the next day with a sickle to cut the weeds and investigate the area, but the next few days it rained heavily. And he actually waited 30 years to share his story publicly because, as he says, and I quote, I did not want to spread this affair to an audience that was not qualified, because I knew that this story was terribly improbable. I said nothing in my parish. I only told it to my family, my governess, and my brothers and sisters. Now later, some skeptical debunkers tried to say that the priest had perhaps encountered a miniature monkey, perhaps from an escaped army regiment or a traveling circus. There was no evidence of this, and the priest remained adamant that he had actually seen a little 6-inch tall man. He remains uncertain whether this little man was from Earth or perhaps even possibly an extraterrestrial. How unusual is that case? Even though this witness only saw it for 15 seconds, he definitely has a lot of detail to it. I suspect that this humanoid might actually be a crypto-terrestrial, one of the little people that are described in so many cultures all over this planet, and not an extraterrestrial. Hard to say for sure, it's pure speculation, but I think that the witness is obviously sincere. He's a priest, a good witness. He definitely saw something, and I don't think that it was a little monkey. I don't know, a really unusual case, and it's certainly not unique. Quite a few people have described very short humanoids. Now here's another case which is so unusual. This one I call, I have never seen anything like it. This is a multiple witness case involving 2 boys who saw multiple humanoids actually. And this one occurred sometime in spring of 1957 in Taboada, Spain. A really unusual case with a number of really interesting details to it. This very interesting case comes from researcher Marcelino Requejo and appears in his book Más allá de lo sobrenatural, which means beyond the supernatural. The witnesses are 2 9-year-old boys known only by their first names of Antonio and Carlos. They were playing in a small field near their homes on the outskirts of Taboada in Lugo, Spain. This was their favorite play spot. They often met up there with friends to amuse themselves, playing kickball, running around. And on this particular cloudy spring afternoon in 1957, their friends had not shown up. So Antonio and Carlos were alone and amused themselves by playing a game of marbles. Now, suddenly Antonio's attention was drawn to movement at a nearby house, and looking up he saw something shocking. This was an abandoned house, and as Antonio says, I saw out of the corner of my eye to the right someone walking, but not at ground level, but higher up, as if in the air. I quickly turned my head towards the old house that was located about 30 meters to the right, and then I saw them. They were moving on the roof of a small brick shed attached to the house. I was speechless. So Antonio slowly stood up and stared in wonder because these figures were walking in the air. He shouted out to his friend Carlos, "Hey, look at those guys!" Now, without getting up, Carlos just turned his head and looked, and with a calmness that astonished Antonio said, "Oh yes, they are always around here. I've seen them before." Now, Antonio most definitely had not seen anything like this, and as he says, "The truth is that it was the most absurd scene. I have never seen anything like it again in my life. Some tall men, dressed like astronauts or beekeepers, with white helmets and suits, but wearing dark boots. They came out from the wall of that abandoned house, one after the other, as if in single file. They walked very slowly on the roof of the shed, as if in slow motion, with one arm extended forward, carrying something like a lantern. The facade of the house had no doors or windows, but the guys came out from there, from the wall itself, as if from nowhere. It's as if they materialized when they came out. And the most incredible thing is that when each of them reached the end of the roof, they walked right where the shed ended. They didn't fall to the ground, but suddenly disappeared, and another guy came out from the wall of the house. I didn't count how many I saw, but at least 10 or 12. The thing must have lasted a little more than a minute. Then they stopped coming out of the wall, and the last one walking on the shed reached the end of the roof and disappeared like the others. So needless to say, Antonio was absolutely astonished, and he immediately began to question Carlos about it. But Carlos seemed weirdly blasé. All he would say is that he didn't know who they were. Antonio then surprised himself by simply continuing to play marbles as if nothing had happened. But while he played, he did say he angrily looked back from time to time to see if these strange figures would appear again, which they didn't. Now afterwards, he didn't tell his parents for fear that they wouldn't believe him, or that if they did believe him, they would forbid him from playing there in that field. Still, the whole experience was so bizarre, especially because Carlos acted as if it was nothing unusual. As Antonio says, "At least I have the consolation of knowing that it was not a hallucination of mine, because my friend Carlos also saw them. What I never understood was his reaction. It seemed normal to him to see those guys walking around there. He remained so cool, and we continued playing marbles as if nothing had happened. Apparently, he had already witnessed that scene on other occasions, but I assure you that he had never said anything to me." Now, years later, Antonio agreed to be interviewed, but insisted on absolute anonymity and did not even want his voice recorded. But as he says, "I assure you that what I experienced that afternoon will remain engraved in my memory for life." There you go. I don't know what's going on in that case. It's interesting that one of the witnesses saw these humanoids multiple times. Another fascinating aspect of this particular case is how the witnesses reacted with sort of a blasé attitude, not talking about it. This is something we see quite often. It's hard to say what's going on here, whether this is some sort of effect put forth by the ETs themselves, or rather our own psychological response to something that's completely unusual and out of our worldview. But yeah, turns up quite a bit. How unusual is that case, with these figures just walking off into mid-air and disappearing? Perhaps there was something about that house or that area that they were interested in. Again, pure speculation, but another interesting case where there are so many. And here's another one. This one is so unusual. There are a few cases where ETs have knocked at people's front door, and that's what happened in this case, which I call an alien at the front door. This one occurred on August 31st, 1968 in Bahia Blanca, Argentina. It was pretty thoroughly researched by experienced investigators as well as the police. The details on it are quite sparse, but it's such an unusual humanoid. Don't know that I've ever heard anything quite like this one. The seemingly endless variety of humanoids is well illustrated by this next very unusual case. which comes from researchers Eduardo A. Tucci and Albert Giordano and was published in their Spanish-language book, Los Platos Volador y sus Tripulantes, or Flying Saucers and Their Crews. It was about 8 p.m. on August 31st, 1968, as the witness, Emilia Susana Larue de Salazar, age 20, was in her home with her two small children when she heard someone knocking very loudly on the front door. She did not open the front door, but instead pulled back the curtain and looked outside. And to her shock, she saw a very tall man, an estimated 6 to 7 feet tall, with very broad shoulders, an athletic, muscular body, and he did not look human. He had no hair on his head, no visible ears, a large mouth full of big teeth, but his eyes were very unusual because they were shining with a brilliant light. Also, his arms were very abnormally long and dangling. He wore a tight-fitting, dull black jumpsuit, and Emilia, as you can imagine, was frozen in fear as this strange figure started to move away backwards, but always keeping his gaze fixed on her. And as he moved off, Emilia heard what sounded to her like peals of muffled laughter coming from this figure. Once he reached the gate of her residence, he seemed to disappear. She did call the police and filed a report, but that's all the details on that very unusual case. How bizarre. I mean, that is really weird. It's interesting because a number of people that I've interviewed who have been, say, taken on board a craft have told me, I just wish the ETs would knock on the front door and I'd invite them in. Well, that did happen in this case, and I know of others. So that alone, I think, makes this case pretty unusual. But that's clearly not a normal person if his eyes are glowing like that, wearing a skin-tight jumpsuit. I mean, something very odd is going on with these humanoid cases. Why did that ET do that? It's very, very strange. Now let's move to the next case, which is really remarkable and got quite a bit of publicity at the time. It involves multiple witnesses, landing traces, and actually multiple incidents as well. I was going to cover just one incident, but there was so much going on this particular date in this particular area that I really just wanted to cover all of the activity that was going on. I call this one ETs Investigate Farmhouse. Again, not just one incident, but the primary one occurred on February 6, 1969 in Pirassununga, Brazil. And I think you'll find this case super fascinating because there are some details in here that I don't know that I've ever heard before. The main witness in this case is Jose Antonio Fioco. He managed the Bela Alianca farm on the outside of Pirassununga, Brazil. You can see the farm here. It was around dusk on February 6, 1969, when Jose heard the pigs on the farm grunting in their pigsty. And going to investigate, this is when he noticed a saucer-shaped craft actually landing next to the farm, only about 600 feet away from him. It was about 15 feet wide, 12 feet high, and resting on tripod landing gear. He immediately noticed 3 humanoid figures which emerged through an opening in the craft. They did not exit the craft, but stood on a sort of platform surrounding the perimeter of the craft. These were short little guys, each about 4 feet tall. He could see that they were human-looking. They had unshaven faces. They wore jumpsuits with what looked to him like 3 metallic buttons down the torso, and metallic, sort of aluminum-looking boots. Now, one of the beings was holding a rod or a tube just about a foot long, and this rod was sending down a beam of light onto the chicken coop about 750 feet away. And it was bright enough so that Jose could actually see the chickens sitting on their perches. The second being held what looked to Jose like a camera-like device, and he was looking through it. And the third being also held a rod or tube slightly larger than the other one, and this guy seemed to be a lookout as he was constantly looking around the environment as if on high alert. So Jose watched all of this with astonishment and decided to alert the others at the farm. He walked very cautiously back to the house, but when he opened the gate, it made a loud creaking sound, and, as if in response, the craft immediately took off, disappearing in just a few seconds. The entire event lasted no more than 3 minutes. But that was not the end of it, because in the days and weeks following this event, the UFOs returned several times. In fact, Jose saw the craft at least twice during the day, hovering about 3,000 feet high, he estimates. He saw it twice at night when they would apparently come down for a landing. And in fact, one evening about a month after the encounter, Jose and at least 15 other people saw one of these craft land in a cotton field about 450 feet from the farm. It very quickly took off, but the next morning they went to this spot and they found unusually thin footprints in the field, which had been freshly plowed. There was no mark in the field in terms of the craft landing there. But 1 month later, Jose witnessed a third landing in the sugarcane field. He saw the craft on the ground for an estimated 3 minutes. He saw figures walking into it, and later an examination of the field showed that some of the sugar canes had been broken and others were uprooted, and there were also more of these same thin footprints. Now, Jose's daughter later told researchers that she had also seen the UFOs on at least 4 separate occasions. Now, here is one of the strangest aspects of this series of encounters. While all of this was going on occasion while watching TV, the programs that the family was watching were replaced by other strange images. Jose, his wife, and their 4 children all saw this. These images included women wearing strange robes with black collars, short male figures wearing helmets. They could hear them speaking in an unknown language, which they said was somewhat similar to Hungarian. The images were very wavy and blurry. They kind of likened it to looking through water. And they connected this to all these UFO encounters. And as it turns out, there were quite a few encounters going on in this area at this time. Because it was the very next day, at 7:30 a.m. on February 7, 1969, 19-year-old Tiago Machado, you can see him here, was woken up by people shouting about a strange craft that had landed on a nearby hill. This is not far away from the other encounter. Tiago decided to grab a pair of binoculars, and he actually walked right up to this craft, approaching to within 30 feet. He described it as a silver metallic domed disc, about 12 feet wide, maybe 5 feet high, and he watched as a door swung open and 2 humanoid figures emerged. They floated down to the ground. He could see 2 other figures inside the craft through the doorway. Now, the 2 that came out appeared to him to be about 4.5 feet tall. They were dressed in skin-tight, seamless silver uniforms and wore transparent helmets. They had yellowish skin, Asian eyes, with one eye being higher than the other, or so it appeared to him, and just a slit for a mouth. They walked around the craft and approached to within 10 feet of the witness. At one point, they seemed to be scared of the binoculars that Tiago was using, so he laid them down on the ground, which seemed to reassure them. Tiago then lit a cigarette and began smoking it. And he says the beings looked at him smoking the cigarette and laughed. He could now see that they had dark teeth. Tiago decided to toss his pack of cigarettes at one of the figures, who placed his hand above the pack, which had landed on the ground, and it floated up into his hand and promptly disappeared. Tiago said that the beings were speaking audibly with, quote, hoarse guttural sounds. Now, a whole group of people was watching this, including Tiago's friends, and one of them shouted out to him, and, as if in response, the humanoids immediately retreated backwards into the craft. Upon entering it, one of the humanoids pointed a tube at Tiago, which sent out a bluish ray which struck him, causing paralysis and some pain, and would later leave a mark on his body. After the craft was gone, Tiago fainted. He woke up shortly later, and he and researchers found imprints on the ground where the craft had rested. You can see them here. Also very interesting is investigators on the scene also reported seeing this object hovering in the sky, or one like it. And there were more encounters. It was just a few days later, on February 9, 1969, 2 boys by the name of Benedito Paulino Ramos and João Batista da Silva, aged 13 and 9 respectively, saw a shiny craft of some kind landed on the ground. They'd never heard of anything like this, so they kind of likened it to a tent. But standing next to it were three helmeted figures wearing shining gray jumpsuits. Now both the boys tried to alert Zhao's mother, but she was too busy working, pulling weeds to pay much attention. But then the boys shouted out that the craft had disappeared and that it was now in the sky, a luminous ball which they said was, quote, the size of the sun, hovering just above the ground. Again, they tried to point it out to Zhao's mother, asking her what it was, but she paid no attention. It was only after the Tiago Machado case was publicized that she realized that the boys had probably seen this craft. And there was another case. A final encounter in Pirassununga occurred on February 12, 1969. Again, just a few days later, was 5:40 a.m. Farmer Luis Flozinho de Oliveira was walking to work with his dog when he says that two 4-foot-tall beings with long hair, beards, and unusual-looking eyes approached him. He said they wore white unbuttoned shirts, beige pants decorated with what looked like colorful inscriptions and drawings, and were also wearing dark, shiny medallions on necklaces on their chest. He says they physically grabbed him, and he immediately fought back, easily knocking them to the ground. He heard the beings speak to each other in a strange language. They then turned to Luis and, speaking perfect Portuguese, told him that since he was much stronger than they would leave him alone, and they immediately fled into the underbrush. Now, during his encounter, Luis's dog curled up on the ground in a ball to protect himself. Following the encounter, he was apparently traumatized. He refused to eat. He would never go near that location of the encounter again. And per the report on this case, he did pass away 1 month later, though it's not clear whether it was a result of this case or not. Not the only case in this area. There was another very unusual case in the same area 1 year earlier. So something's going on in this area that is attracting the interest of the ETs. Very, very strange. There must have been something in this area that the ETs found of interest, there being so many encounters over such a short period of time. But so well authenticated. I mean, we've got dozens of people in that one case seeing this UFO land, and one of the witnesses walking right up to it and having an interaction with these ETs. Something like this is really hard to deny. With all the landing traces and the footprints, one of the most fascinating things for me about this case, the first one in particular, was the weird images that appeared on the television. I mean, how do you explain that? Hard to say for sure whether this was related directly to their encounter, but the witnesses certainly thought so. Very strange. Lots to unravel and unpack in all of these cases. Now let's move to the next one, which is a fairly straightforward account, if you can call a UFO encounter straightforward. It's a pretty interesting one though. Very close-up observation of a UFO and humanoids by two witnesses. I call this one Two Human-Like Figures. This occurred in January of 1974 in Pejsted, Denmark. Probably butchered that name, so sorry. But yeah, this is a really interesting case because this shows, like many other cases, what appears to be ETs showing themselves on purpose. Can't say for sure, but given that the witnesses describe these ETs looking directly at them, certainly makes me wonder about it. This next case involves two witnesses, a father and son. They're anonymous. It's quite a brief incident, but certainly interesting. They were in their home in Pjedsted in Frederica, Jutland, Denmark. This case was published in the magazine UFO Neat in the September-October 1977 issue. Now this case began when the adult son woke up to see a bright yellow light coming from outside. He woke up his father. They both went into the living room and, looking out the window, saw this very strange craft hovering about 450 feet away. And it lit up the interior of their house so brightly that, as one of the witnesses said, he could have found a pin on the floor. Now, as the father says, and I quote, "It turned out to be a circular object standing immediately behind the trees, with about half of the object visible above the trees." With binoculars and the naked eye, two human-like figures could be easily seen wearing a gray-white, tight-fitting suit. Now, the witnesses said that the figures did have normal human features. They saw that their hands were bare, no gloves on them, but they did see that the figures were wearing dark-colored helmets, which they said were very much like ski helmets with a transparent visor. And as the witnesses watched the figures, these figures appeared to be staring right back at them. As the father says, while we were looking at the object and the figures through the binoculars, they tilted a visor down in front of their faces. The object tilted slightly forward as if to be able to better look down towards the house where we were staying. So this was a sort of staring contest which lasted a full 5 minutes. At which point the light from the object went out, the object was no longer visible, or it disappeared and moved away. But one detail noted by the witnesses was that both the figures were wearing what looked like a necklace, which held a sort of rectangular apparatus of some kind, quite small, just a few inches in diameter. They had no idea what the purposes of this apparatus might be. How interesting is that? I would love to have an experience like that. Just seeing a UFO hover outside your house, ET's looking down at you. It's a pretty fascinating case, and I certainly wonder about it. Because did this craft show up there on purpose to show themselves to these two people? Or was it just a chance encounter? Hard to say for sure, but it sure is unusual given that the ETs were looking down directly at them. And kind of the staring contest went on for a number of minutes. Really unusual. And here's another case which also has these unusual aspects to it. I call this next case the Alien in the Forest. This occurred on January 4, 1977 in Carapito, Portugal. I'm telling you, these cases are occurring everywhere. This one does appear to be a chance encounter. Hard to say for sure. But this gentleman was out there in the wilderness with his dog and had this amazing UFO encounter with a humanoid. This very unusual case comes from well-known researcher Juan Ballester Olmos and was published in his book, Encyclopedia of Close Encounters with UFOs. The witness is anonymous and is known only by his initials, CACM. For the purpose of this report, I'll just give him the pseudonym Carlos. He was employed as a technician at an automobile plant, and it was around 12:30 a.m. on January 4, 1977, just after midnight, a clear, moonlit night. Carlos was training his dog, a German Shepherd, in a rural field surrounded by pine trees not far from his home in Carapito, Beira Alta. This is in Portugal. And the first indication of anything unusual was when Carlos's dog became agitated and ran back towards him, sitting down next to him. This is when Carlos looked up and saw a dark metallic object hovering not far away, about 30 feet he estimates, 30 feet up in the air. And this craft was not huge, it was an estimated 20 feet in diameter. He could see a dome-like structure on top. And he could also hear that it was making a weird, staticky, kind of beep, beep, beep noise. And it was around the same time that Carlos noticed this craft that he also saw a humanoid figure standing on the ground below it at the foot of a small hill. This figure was about, he estimates, 5.5 feet tall, had a bulky, heavy-set body, but a normal, human-like appearance. It was making no movements, it just stood there. And, after only a few moments, the craft emitted a bright flash of silvery light, and both the craft and the figure disappeared. And that was pretty much the end of it. The dog now showed no concern or fear. But, following the encounter, the witness did suffer from some physiological effects, apparently related to this encounter. He said he had severe headaches and weakness, which were bad enough that he was unable to work and did consult a doctor. Also, later researchers did find a compressed circle of vegetation about 8 feet wide, not far from the grove of pine trees where Carlos had seen this craft. They did use a radiation detector where Carlos had seen the figure and measured higher than normal amounts of radiation, though they did say that there are known uranium deposits in this general area. Now, shortly after this incident, Carlos's dog ran away, but did reappear several months later. 8 months after this encounter, the dog, while still young of age, did die of unknown causes, but again, not clear if this is in any way connected to the UFO encounter. A weird case for sure, and yeah, a single witness case, but then again, there's possible landing traces associated with it, and that makes you wonder, how many other people could have seen this thing and just didn't report on it. It's absolutely possible a number of people did see it. Let's move to the next encounter, which is very unusual. Haven't heard of one quite like this. This is a very, very large humanoid, which I call the giant glowing figure. This occurred one evening in November of 1977 in the Megalong Valley in Australia. And this is apparently just a chance encounter with people driving down a remote road late at night and seeing something quite unusual. But as it turns out, there's quite a bit of activity in this area. So that maybe there's something to this area that is attracting the attention of the UFOs and their occupants. But I think you'll find this case quite interesting. Multiple cases, actually. This next unusual case is quite brief, but it's apparently only one of several unusual UFO events in this area. It involves two witnesses, a married couple by the name of John and Gail Weldon. It was about 10 p.m. one evening in November of 1977 as the Weldons drove along the Jenolan Caves Road in the Megalong Valley after visiting the very famous Jenolan Caves. They were just a few miles out of the small town of Hampton along this road, which you can see here, when they saw what they described as a gigantic, yellow, glowing humanoid form. They said it emerged from the thick scrub on the passenger side of their vehicle and proceeded to walk towards the road. In mere moments, it was crossing the road just about 45 feet in front of their car. Now John, who was driving, immediately pressed the brakes and brought the car to a halt, at which point the being promptly strode towards the now terrified couple and towered over their car, staring down at them. The Weldons could now see that this figure did have a human-like face, but just after a few seconds, this very tall being turned and walked off the road and back into the wilderness. And as you can imagine, the Weldons quickly raced away. So that's it in terms of that encounter, but again, it's not the only encounter to occur in the Megalong Valley. 5 years earlier, in nearby Katoomba, the Edelbuttel family became witnesses to an incredible UFO event that was very well verified and publicized as well. It was one evening in July of 1971 that Bernie and Merle Edelbuttel were hosting Merle's sister and husband, Ann and Bill Pierce, at their home. Strangely, throughout the evening, they noticed that the TV was showing an unusual amount of static, but didn't think too much of it until after what happened next, because it was around 10:30 p.m. that evening that the Pierces decided to leave and return home. 10 minutes later, they came back to the house pale and shaken, because as Bill Pierce says, as we were driving out of the yard, we saw a strange orange light in the back paddock where the pigs are kept. At first I thought it was a fire, then a row of truck lights, but it was glowing too brightly to be either. It looked like a ring of small lights and was about 200 yards away, lighting up the trees. As it glowed, it increased in intensity until it hurt to look straight at the light. It was exactly like looking. Now Bill's wife Ann also saw it, and as she says, it must have been a UFO because it was so unearthly. Neither my husband nor I are nervous, but this terrified us. Even my little 4-year-old pointed to it and said, "Monster lights." So they watched this for about 5 minutes when the strange lights merged into one and faded away. And as Bill says, I have no idea what it was. I have never seen anything like it in my life. Now reportedly the Edelbuttels also saw this object which they described as saucer-shaped and of considerable size. And as it turns out, there were numerous other witnesses to this event. People driving along the Great Western Highway also described seeing this light. Another farmer who lived near this family also said that they saw a large dark object descend slowly into the Megalong Valley and actually land in a deserted field. This witness described this object as being about 30 feet wide and totally silent. It remained on the ground for 10 minutes, then rose upwards and darted off. Where it landed, there was a circular depression on the ground where the grass would no longer grow. Now, police were of course called, but the UFO had left by that time, and further investigation revealed that only the week before this, numerous people in the area were reporting seeing strange lights. Now, there is one final case, which this occurred much more recently, one evening in September 2019. This is approximate. It was around 9 p.m. when a gentleman by the name of Charlie Kennedy was driving through the forest just off the Jenolan Caves Road. Without warning, his car engine died, so he got out of his vehicle to check the engine, and this is when he saw what he describes as a large, quote, flying saucer. He said it was 45 feet wide, had a dome on top, was hovering just above the road. The bottom of this craft, he said, had several round yellow lights, and the dome itself was also encircled by lights. And as Charlie says, I was worried about what might happen next. But the saucer began emitting a thumping sound and rose rapidly high into the air and flew off slowly into a pine-forested valley to the southeast out of sight. I found the car could be started again, so I lost no time in getting out of the area. There you go. I don't mean to be rude, but those who are skeptical of UFOs simply have not done their research. How many cases is it going to take? How many people have to see humanoids before all humanity accepts the fact that we are not alone in this universe? There are a lot of people out there. I mean, it's just case after case after case after case. Here's another one, which I call, What Beautiful Eyes. That is a direct quote from the witness. This case occurred in May of 1991 in Istok, Russia. Again, cases coming from all over the world. And this one is really unusual, because to me, the most fascinating aspect of this case is how the witness describes this humanoid. And almost always, witnesses are really impressed by the being's eyes. And that's certainly true in this case, which is primarily a single witness case, but not really, because as it turns out, she was in an apartment building and other people saw the UFO outside at the time she was having her encounter with a humanoid. I want to give thanks to Alberto Rosales for calling my attention to this case, which comes from researcher Maxim Shishkin, who published it in an article called Aliens in the Urals in the 7-8 1995 issues of the Ural Pathfinder. This incident took place in Istok. This is near Yekaterinburg, Russia, and involves a lady known only by her initials KT. She lived in an apartment building. And it was around 11 p.m. one evening in late May of 1991 that Katie went to bed, but for some reason had trouble falling asleep, and actually remained awake for 3 hours until about 2 o'clock in the morning. At this time her bedroom door was open. She could hear her husband watching hockey on the TV in the living room, and she was just starting to doze off when she heard the door creaking, followed by footsteps. So she didn't see anybody, got out of bed, looked into the living room. Her husband was still on the couch watching TV. Nobody else was in the house except for her young daughter, who remained asleep in Katie's bedroom next to Katie's bed. So that was weird. Didn't think too much of it. She crawled back into bed, started to fall asleep, when again she heard footsteps. And this time she heard him heading towards the bathroom and then moving beyond. She thought it was her husband, but she became scared, kept her eyes closed, and this is when she heard the footsteps enter her room and stand next to her bed. Immediately she began to feel some strange sensations. She said her body cramped and her arms and legs began to straighten out. Then she actually felt someone's hands lifting her off the bed. At this point she tried to move and scream, but found that she was unable to, but with great effort she was able to groan. Whoever was lifting her abruptly removed his hands, and Katie fell back onto the bed. She heard the steps move off towards the bedroom door. She still kept her eyes closed, but when she felt someone's gaze staring at her, she opened her eyes. There was nobody there, but she did know that she was unable to see anything from behind the headboard of her bed. So after a few minutes, she sat up, looked, and saw a white circle in the doorway. And this is when she saw something else. And I'll just describe it in Katie's own words. As she says, "A creature a little over a meter tall was standing nearby. It was a small man with a large head, the proportions of which did not correspond to the body. On the head was a white hat, very reminiscent of a Muslim turban in its outline. My attention was drawn to the face, especially the large eyes with long eyelashes and a blackness inside. I thought, what beautiful eyes!" And then he stepped into the middle of the circle, blocking it with his body, after which everything disappeared. I sat on the bed for a while, shaking violently with fear. After a few minutes, Katie got up and checked the house. Her daughter was still asleep. Everything seemed normal. She looked for her husband, and he was now asleep on the couch. She returned to bed but didn't sleep that night. And the next night she said she also had trouble sleeping because it looked like, as she says, rays were coming out of the wall. Now, her case did reach investigators, and they found out that on the same night Katie had seen this humanoid, other residents in her apartment building also reported strange events, including hearing strange clicking noises, hearing the sounds of footsteps, and also finding mysteriously unlocked and open windows and doors. Most significantly, a few reported seeing a glowing yellow UFO outside of the apartment building, sending down 3 beams of light. How weird is that? I mean, in some ways, that does sound like a typical gray, but then again, the eyelashes and the weird hat on top of the head, I don't know, it's very odd. I'm perplexed by the wide variety of descriptions people give of humanoids. But I suppose it's not that surprising when you consider the wide variety of people here on this planet alone. I mean, all the different ancestries. We have people who are quite short, people who are quite tall, all kinds of skin complexions, all kinds of different shapes to people. So I suppose it's just the way things are. The humanoid form does seem to be the universal template. Almost always people do describe beings that we would say are bipedal. I don't know. This is kind of what we're stuck with. This is what the evidence is showing us. Here is another case which involves a gentleman who actually saw 2 different humanoids on 2 separate occasions, and both are very, very unusual. One's super short and the other has wings. So yeah, I call this one 2 very strange humanoids. First case occurred in winter of 1994 in Musée, Italy. And both these incidents involving this witness are actually multiple witness encounters. So he's not the only one who saw these very strange humanoids. This next case involves 2 separate incidents, both of which come from Italian researcher Pier Giorgio Murgia, and were published in his book, Aliens in the Land of Mirages. This is both in English and in Italian. This is a multiple witness case, and the first incident involves 2 witnesses. Now, this took place in the town of Musée, located in Sardinia, Italy. The main witness is Simone Saba, who at this time was 22 years old. It was one evening in the winter of 1994. It was a full moon. Simone and his friend were driving to Simone's house. They were in the rural countryside on the outskirts of Musée, heading along a dirt road, when suddenly the headlight of the motorbike that they were riding illuminated a very small humanoid figure. This figure appeared to be less than 1 foot tall, and they could both see that it looked very much like a person, but with several marked differences. First, its head was oversized for its body. It had very thin hair, pointed ears. The body also was very thin. The being did not appear to have any clothes on. Now Simone, who was driving, saw it first and immediately alerted his friend, who also saw this strange being. This being had been walking across the road, but stopped when the headlights from the motorbike shone on him. It looked briefly at the two witnesses, and then quickly continued walking across the road and disappeared into the bushes. Now in the days following this encounter, Simone traveled the same route with his dogs, and on each occasion the dogs would stop and excitedly smell the area exactly where this being had disappeared into the bushes. It was not long after the encounter that a fire broke out in this area, not related, but it left the terrain bare of any vegetation, and it was then that Simone discovered a strange round hole in the ground exactly where the being had disappeared. He wondered if perhaps this little hole was where the being had come from or escaped to on the night of his encounter. Now this turned out not to be Simone's only encounter. 15 years earlier, when he was only 7 years old, he had a really frightening encounter, and there were other witnesses. At that time, he and his family lived in a rented home. This is the same town of Musée. The home had a locked attic, which they had never had the opportunity to explore, but always wondered what was in it. Now, one evening in autumn of 1979, Simone, his little sister Daniela, who was 2 years old, and another child friend were playing outside the house when they noticed movement at the locked attic window of this house. And looking up, they could see a strange humanoid figure perched by the window. They said it was about 4 to 5 feet tall, had an abnormally long neck, a human-looking face with a kind of lumpy, oversized forehead, glowing red eyes, and dark black skin. But most strikingly, this figure had huge wings, similar to those of a bat, with a wingspan of about 6 feet. And as it lingered by the window for a few moments, Simone called out his father Antonio, who came out and also saw this strange winged being. At this point, the being leapt upwards into the air, hovered there momentarily, fluttering for a few moments, and then flew off into the darkness of the night. Panicked and afraid, the 4 witnesses rushed into the house. Antonio, the father, in fact, was so overcome by the sight that he actually wept with emotion. They never saw this winged being again. Very, very strange. Again, I'm not sure that we can label both these humanoids as, quote, extraterrestrials. That short little guy could very well be, again, more on the lines of an elf or gnome or dwarf or whatever you want to call these little people that we see in so many different cultures. And as far as this winged being, I wonder about that too. Very much kind of like the Mothman of Point Pleasant, Virginia years ago. Not a unique description. There's quite a few cases of winged beings, which I wonder about too. I think it is significant that no UFO was seen in either of those incidents. So perhaps that winged being was an interdimensional creature. Still lots of questions surrounding all of this, but I think it's important that we document these cases because clearly something is going on. It would be wholly unscientific to ignore them. There are far too many cases, far too many witnesses, far too much evidence to explain this all away as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, or mental illness, which is exactly what our governments have tried so hard to make us think. It's not true. These things are real. Here's another case, very unusual. Again, witnesses are often impressed by the being's eyes. True in this case, I call this one Eyes Like a Fly. This one occurred on May 10, 1995 in Columbia, Missouri. It is a single witness case, but I really feel for this witness, who was a young child, who had a very, very close encounter with what appears to be a gray-type extraterrestrial. This next case was reported on by Albert Rosales, also was reported to NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, and did appear in the UFO Intelligence newsletter and the publication Action. It is a single witness case involving an anonymous young man. There's no physical evidence supporting this case, but nevertheless it's quite compelling. I'll call the witness Ethan. That's a pseudonym. This is not his real name. It was just before 3 a.m. on May 10, 1995. Ethan was in his father's home in Columbia, Missouri, reading the Time Life book Mystic Places, all about Stonehenge and other places. Suddenly he was distracted by a strange computer-like beeping noise. And after hearing this for about 10 minutes, he decided to get up, leave his bedroom, and investigate the source of this beeping. So he walked down the hallway to the family room and the kitchen. The only source of illumination was a small light over the kitchen sink. But standing in the family room, Ethan caught movement out of the corner of his eye, and looking through the double sliding glass patio door, which the blinds were open, he saw something unusual. This is where the movement was coming from. So he approached to within about 3 feet of the patio door and looked outside when, to his shock, he saw a small humanoid figure walk right up to the patio door, stop about 3 feet away, and peer inside. Although it was dark, the light from the kitchen was sufficient to illuminate the area, and Ethan could immediately see that this figure was not human. He described it as, quote, a little man. He estimates that it was about 3.5, maybe 4 feet tall. It had a large head and, quote, eyes like a fly. This figure was very slender, with 2 abnormally long arms, extremely long fingers, was silvery gray in color, and was either naked or wore a skin-tight full-body jumpsuit. At this point, the being leaned forward from the waist and stared directly at the witness. Shocked and frozen with fear, Ethan had no choice but to just stare back. He said that he had never been so scared in his life, and that the hair, quote, stood up on his arms. This staring contest lasted for just a few minutes, at which point Ethan suddenly broke free from his paralysis, ran straight to the kitchen, retrieved a butcher knife, and took shelter in the corner of the family room just out of view of the sliding door. He was too afraid to look to see if this being was still there, and he remained huddled there in fear for nearly an hour. Finally, about 4 a.m., he summoned the courage to rush in panic into his father's bedroom, woke him up, and told him what happened. His father immediately checked the house and the patio area, but this little man was gone. So he called the Columbia Police Department, who referred him to the National UFO Reporting Center, and this resulted in the case being officially investigated and reported. The poor kid in this case, hovering there in the corner of his living room for almost an hour. I can only imagine what an impression that this encounter had on him. They called the police, who of course referred them to Newfork, which led to this case being officially investigated. So I think it was just those sheer emotions of this encounter that really prompted the witness to report it. And I'm glad he did, because people deserve to know about these cases. Here's another one, super interesting, a multiple witness case. I call this one the ETs in the Rain. This occurred in October of 1995 in Breitbrunn, Germany. Again, a multiple witness case involving animal reactions as well, and some really interesting and unusual behavior on the part of the ETs. I do think these are ETs, given that they were standing right next to a saucer-shaped craft covered with multicolored lights, as we shall see. This case was published in a German publication. You can see it here. It involves 2 witnesses, Carolyn and Veronica. The 2 girls, 13 years old, were riding their horses in the rain along a path through a forest in the Breitbrunn area of Germany. While riding, they came to a crossroads where there was a 120-foot-long path leading to a lower clearing in the forest. And it was there that the witnesses saw colored lights that first looked to them like, quote, some kind of circus event. So they approached closer, and this is when they saw that it wasn't a circus. In fact, the colored lights were attached to a gray craft. They said it was shaped like a shallow plate or bowl with a dome on top. The perimeter of the craft was encircled with multicolored lights, red, green, yellow, and blue, and standing next to it were short little munchkin-like figures. They actually uses the word munchkin. Now, one of the little humanoids held up a large pitchfoot leaf over his head, apparently using it like an umbrella, presumably to shield him from the rain which was coming down. At this point, the girls' horses shied, and the girls became frightened. The next thing they knew, the craft rose 15 feet up into the air and darted away so quickly, it looked to them almost like it disappeared. Researchers later learned that multiple farmers in Oberndorf, which was less than 2 miles away, also saw the craft depart. Now, one of the witnesses, Carolyn, says she has some memory gaps and that there may be more to this event than she can consciously recall. I think it's significant that in this case, one of the witnesses, Carolyn, says that she has some memory gaps. It's a huge red flag there. Whenever anyone is very close to a UFO, the chances of this being a more extensive encounter, perhaps an onboard experience, goes way up. So it's entirely possible this is more than just a sighting of a landed UFO and a humanoid, but could be a onboard experience. Hard to say for sure, but it's interesting to me that it wasn't just these two girls who saw this UFO. There were multiple witnesses who saw this craft taking off. I've said it before, but one person's sighting is often another person's onboard encounter. Not sure that that's what happened in this case, but it's certainly a possibility. Now let's move to the last and final case in this collection, which is super interesting and quite scary, actually, certainly for the witness. I call this one Charged by an Alien. This occurred one evening in July of 2018 to a young teenage witness. His age isn't described exactly, but that does appear to be inferred in this case, which occurred in a rural area of Newaygo, Michigan. It's a really unusual humanoid. Can't say I've heard one described quite like this. It does appear perhaps to be a variation of the typical gray, but not typical by any means, as we shall see. This case comes from researcher-author Nathaniel Brislin and was published in his book, Crawlers, a Conclusive Casebook. The witness is anonymous. I'll call him Jacob. That's a pseudonym. It was around 7:30 p.m. one evening in July 2018 that he and his family went to visit his grandparents, who lived in a very rural area outside of Newaygo, Michigan. In fact, the closest other house was more than a mile away, so a very rural area. And on the evening in question, Jacob was in front of the house hitting golf balls out into the pasture next to the house. After hitting all the golf balls, he ventured out into the pasture to go collect them. Now, the property was gated to keep the dogs contained, so he went beyond the gate, closing it behind him. He collected most of the balls in the pasture, but he knew that he had hit a few beyond the pasture and into the forested area at the edge. So he went to go collect those. It was then that he heard footsteps among the leaves coming from behind him, and also a weird sound, which he said was kind of like water dripping off of someone who had just stepped out of the shower. But the strange thing was, the sound would start and stop. So Jacob speculated that perhaps it was the wind blowing water from the leaves on the trees. Collecting what he thought was the last golf ball, he turned and started to walk back, and this is when he saw a tall figure step behind a tree. He only caught a brief glimpse of movement, so he couldn't discern what it was at this point, but he knows he saw something, and very curious, he remained still and intently watched the area where he had seen this figure disappear. And his patience was rewarded, because after just a few moments, this figure came out from behind the tree, and to his amazement, it was crawling out on all fours. He first saw its long skinny arms, followed by its head. He could see that it had a large bald head, large dark round eyes, 2 holes for a nose, a long slit for a mouth, a long exaggerated chin, and he said it crawled completely out from behind the tree, at which point he was impressed by how skinny its arms and legs were. It gave the creature an almost starved appearance. He said its skin was dark and glistened with wetness. Its torso looked almost twisted up and malformed. How he described it was like an unorganized mass of flesh. Its hands and feet, he noticed, were much longer than a normal person's. It was at this point that this strange creature turned and looked directly at Jacob. And this is when he noticed that that strange watery sound that he had heard earlier was coming from this creature, and it seemed to be coming from the being's nostril holes. Now he was pretty close to this thing, about 75 feet away, close enough he said that he could see its nostrils flaring. At this point the being stood up, reaching a height of about 6.5 feet tall. He said it moved its neck in a way that seemed unnatural, and again looked directly at the witness. Jacob remained frozen to the spot and just stared in shock and fear, when suddenly this creature did something totally unexpected. It charged right at him, running right towards him. Jacob was too stunned and surprised to react in any way, just tried to prepare himself for this confrontation. But instead of hitting him, this creature ran right by him, through the woods, and disappeared. Jacob turned and watched as it kept running, and it alternated between running on all fours and on 2 feet. And again, Jacob had the impression that this creature's body looked contorted, unnatural, and as he said, quote, off. Now he was afraid, as you can imagine, so he ran out of the field, back to the property, closed the gate behind him, and at first he didn't tell his grandfather what he had seen, but later he did. And to his surprise, he received confirmation, because his grandfather said that he had seen this same creature before, while walking through the trails in the woods around the property. How weird is that? Can you imagine seeing the very tall, skinny, kind of misshapen being like that? And have it run directly towards you? Whew, that would be scary, I think, for anybody. So another interesting case. And again, how many cases like this will it take for this subject to be fully accepted? We're all victims of the UFO cover-up. Let's face it, our own governments have spent an enormous amount of time, money, and energy, our tax dollars, to explain away all of these cases, again, as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness, all the while knowing that this is a real phenomenon. Our governments, or secret governments, whatever you want to call it, the cabal, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, the highest levels of the military, I think these are the folks behind the cover-up. They've known for decades that this is a real phenomenon and are still covering it up. It's not only disingenuous and cruel, but I think it's a huge mistake. Truth and transparency is, I think, the best course of action with this subject. Sooner or later, it's going to come out. So it's a lost cause trying to cover up these encounters. It is moving into the mainstream. It's a new era for humanity as this subject grows in popularity and more people are accepting the reality that we are being visited by extraterrestrials and we are not alone. So that's it for today. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned something new. I always learn something new each time I do the research for these episodes. I work real hard at this, as you know. I think this is an important subject, and if we could all just accept this subject, it would change the world, and I think bring us all together. So yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate you guys watching, and until next time, keep asking those questions, keep searching for the truth, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.